Der Chef ist tot. The boss is dead. These 4 chilling words echo from a concrete room. They are not shouted, they are stated, and they signal the end of a 1,000-year empire. The date is April 30th, 1945, deep beneath the rubble of Berlin, in a damp, suffocating concrete tomb called the Fuhrerbunker. One man sits at his post. He is surrounded by the stench of diesel fumes, cheap schnapps, and human despair. His name is Rochus Misch. He is a bodyguard. He is a courier. But most importantly, he is the bunker's telephone switchboard operator. He is the heart that pumps the final dying messages of the Nazi regime. He just heard his boss, Adolf Hitler, say his final goodbye. He watched Hitler and Eva Braun disappear behind a steel door. He waits. The entire bunker waits. The silence is louder than the thunder of the Russian artillery overhead. Then, a single muffled gunshot. Or perhaps no sound at all. Misch himself would later say he heard nothing. But what happened next was the sound of history collapsing. The door opens. A man, Hitler's valet, peers out. He sees Misch at the switchboard. He whispers, "The boss is dead." Moments later, Misch will see the body of Hitler, slumped in a chair. He will see Eva Braun's body, legs tucked up on the sofa. He will watch as they carry the bodies up the stairs to the garden, to be burned. This is the climax. But for Rochus Misch, it is not the end. He will be the last man to see the Goebbels family alive. He will be the last man to hear their final monstrous act. And he will be the absolute last man to leave the bunker alive. This is not the story of a general or a politician. This is the story of the witness, the man who saw everything, the man who held the secrets of the bunker until his death in 2013. How did a simple painter end up as the final confidant to history's greatest monster? And what horrors did he witness in those final terrible days? To understand how one man became the final witness to an empire's collapse, we must rewind. We must go back before the bunker, before the war, before the SS uniform. We must go back to a quiet town in Opole, Silesia, where Rochus Misch was born in 1917. His life began with loss. His father, a soldier, died before he was born. His mother died when he was just 2. He was an orphan, raised by his grandparents. His first ambition was not to conquer the world. It was to paint it. Misch was an apprentice painter, a tradesman. He was skilled with a brush, quiet and unassuming. He had no grand political dreams. He just wanted a stable life, a future. But in 1930s Germany, stability was a luxury. The economy was a wreck. The streets were full of chaos. Like many young men of his generation, Misch sought a reliable future. He found it in the military. In 1937, he joined the SS Verfügungstruppe, the SSVT. This was the unit that would eventually become the infamous Waffen-SS, but for Misch, this was not an ideological choice. He later claimed he knew little of the party's darker aims. To him, it was a job. It was a secure posting, a smart black uniform, and a sense of purpose. He was physically fit, loyal, and had a clean record. He was exactly what they were looking for. He served in the invasion of Poland in 1939. He was a soldier. He fought. He was wounded in the Battle of Modlin, shot in the chest. He was decorated with the Iron Cross, second class. He had proven his loyalty. He had proven his courage. And this brush with death, is what changed his life. Because he was a decorated, wounded veteran of the SSVT, he was promoted. He was offered a new post, a post away from the front lines. He was hand-picked, along with other politically reliable and physically imposing soldiers, for a new unit. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. This was not the army. This was Hitler's personal bodyguard. In early 1940, Misch was brought to the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. He was no longer just a soldier. He was now part of the inner circle. His first job was not glamorous. He was a driver, a courier, a general dog's body. He was the man who opened the door, who carried the briefcase, who stood in the hallway while history was being made inside the room. He was trained to be invisible, to see nothing, to hear nothing, but he saw everything. He traveled with Hitler to the Berghof, his mountain retreat in the Alps. He traveled to the Wolf's Lair, the secret headquarters in Prussia. Misch was not a general. He did not plan invasions. He was staff. But this is what made his position so unique. The generals saw Hitler for meetings. The politicians saw him for decrees. Rochus Misch saw him every single day. He saw Hitler in his dressing gown, late at night, in the chancellery. He saw him playing with his German shepherd, Blondie. He heard the casual conversations, the private jokes, the moments of calm before the storm. He saw the man, not just the Führer. Misch was the ultimate insider, precisely because he was a complete outsider. He was the help. He had no power. He had no ambition. He just wanted to do his job, and then his role shifted again. This shift is what sealed his fate as the last witness. In 1942, Hitler's permanent telephone operator was drafted for combat. They needed a replacement. They needed someone who was always there, someone who was completely trustworthy, someone who was already invisible. They chose Rochus Misch. This was, perhaps, the most sensitive job in the entire Reich. Misch was given a tiny, windowless office, no bigger than a closet, right next to Hitler's private study. He was given a chair, a headset, and a web of wires. Rochus Misch became the Führer's personal telephone and switchboard operator. Think about this. In a world before email, before encrypted digital lines, every single message had to go through a human being. That human was Misch. When propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels wanted to speak to the Führer, he did not call Hitler. He called Misch. When Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring needed to report, he called Misch. When SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, the most feared man in Europe, wanted to give an update, his adjutant had to go through Rochus Misch. Misch was the gatekeeper. He was the hub. He listened to the frustrated sighs of generals. He heard the panic in the voices of regional governors as the Reich began to crack. He heard the lies they told Hitler, and he heard the truths they told each other. He was a living, breathing audio recording of the entire Nazi high command. And he was loyal. His loyalty was not to the Nazi ideology, he would later claim. His loyalty was to his job. He was a professional. He was the man who connected the calls, who delivered the letters, who never spoke out of turn. This loyalty, this invisible professionalism, is what earned him Hitler's complete, absolute trust. Hitler was surrounded by ambitious, backstabbing fanatics. Göring, Goebbels, Himmler, Bormann. They were all rivals playing a game of power. But Misch? Misch was just the telephone man. He was safe. He was reliable. He was a piece of furniture. This reliability would be his curse. It would chain him to his post as the world came crashing down. By 1944, the war was lost. The D-Day invasions had succeeded. The Red Army was a tidal wave, crushing everything in its path from the east. Germany was being squeezed to death. Hitler's world began to shrink. He left his mountaintop retreats. He abandoned his forest lairs. The Allies were bombing Berlin into rubble from the sky. The Red Army was advancing on the ground. The Führer, the man who had commanded all of Europe, was now a cornered animal, and he was forced to move underground. In January 1945, Hitler's entire inner circle, his staff, his generals, and his secretaries, descended into a concrete complex 50 feet beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden. They called it the Fuhrerbunker, and Rochus Misch, the telephone man, went with him. He was given a new switchboard in a tiny room right at the bottom of the stairs. His post was strategically placed between Hitler's private quarters and the main conference room. He was, once again, at the absolute center of the spider's web. But this was not the Berghof. This was not a palace. The Fuhrerbunker was a tomb. It was a two-level concrete box, cold, damp, and claustrophobic. The air was thick with the constant, deafening hum of the diesel generator that provided their only light and air. The walls dripped with moisture. The smell was a mix of diesel, sweat, and stale food. The atmosphere was a bizarre, surreal mix of routine and madness. Above ground, the world was ending. The Red Army was now in the suburbs of Berlin. The city was on fire. The ground shook, day and night, from the constant thunder of Soviet artillery. The bunker itself would physically lift and drop with the force of the largest bombs. But downstairs, in the bunker, Hitler demanded normalcy. Generals would arrive, their uniforms stained with dust from bombed-out cars, to brief Hitler on armies that no longer existed. They would stand over maps, moving imaginary divisions, while Misch sat at his switchboard, listening. He listened as the calls became more desperate, more frantic, more pathetic. A general from the front line, screaming for ammunition, for reinforcements, for anything. A city mayor, begging for evacuation orders that would never come. An SS commander, reporting that the Russians were now 2 streets away. And Misch, with his calm professional voice, would say, "The Führer is in conference," or, "I will try to connect you." He was connecting calls to ghosts. He was patching through messages of total collapse, only to hear Hitler in the next room planning a grand counterattack that would save Berlin. The disconnect was total, but the bunker was not just for soldiers. It had become a strange, dysfunctional home. Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime mistress, had her own room. She had a direct line from her bedroom to Misch's switchboard. She would call him at all hours, asking to be put through to Hitler, or simply to chat. She called him Misch, the familiar du form. He was her connection to the outside world. A world that was now just a few dozen people in a concrete box. He was the friendly voice, the man who was not a fanatic, the man who still represented a normal life. And then there were the children. In one of the most bizarre and tragic decisions of the war, Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, had moved his entire family into the bunker. His wife, Magda, and their 6 young children, Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Hold, Hedda, and Haida. The children, all under the age of 13, were a ray of sunshine in that concrete hell. They were oblivious to the reality of their situation. They played in the narrow corridors. They sang songs for Uncle Adolf, and they would gather around Rochus Misch's switchboard. Misch was a father himself. His wife Gerda and his daughter Brigitte were outside, somewhere in the burning city. He would look at the Goebbels children and see his own. He would let them play with the headset. He would talk to them. They adored him. He was a moment of kindness in a world of monsters. This kindness, this human connection, would soon become the source of his greatest nightmare. The tension in the bunker was stretching to a breaking point. The date was April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday. The last of the High Command, the Paladins, arrived to pay their respects. Göring, Himmler, Speer. They came to the bunker, gave their congratulations, ate cake, and then they fled. One by one, they made their excuses and left Berlin, abandoning their Führer to his fate. Rochus Misch, at his switchboard, was the man who arranged their final calls, their final transportation. He was, quite literally, watching the rats leave the sinking ship. And then the great betrayal happened. First, a message arrived from Hermann Göring, who had fled to the south. It was a telegram. Göring, citing a 1941 decree, announced that since Hitler was trapped in Berlin, he, Göring, was now the new Führer. Hitler exploded. He went into a rage, screaming, "Treason!" He ordered Göring arrested. He ordered him stripped of all titles. Misch heard the screams. He was the one who had to transmit the messages to have Göring arrested. But just as that fire was burning, a second, more devastating betrayal was revealed. News reached the bunker that Heinrich Himmler, faithful Heinrich, the head of the SS, the man Misch had served under, was secretly negotiating a surrender with the Western Allies through Sweden. This broke Hitler. According to witnesses, on April 22nd, Hitler suffered a total nervous collapse. In a meeting with his generals, he finally admitted the truth. He slammed his fist on the table. He screamed. He raged that his generals had lied. His SS had betrayed him. He was surrounded by traitors. He shouted, "The war is lost!" He collapsed into his chair, a broken man. He announced he would stay in Berlin. He would not run. He would die in the capital. For everyone in the bunker, this was the end. The spell was broken. The man they had followed, the man they had worshipped, had given up. The bunker split into two groups. Those who could leave did. Secretaries, adjutants, and staff were given permission to break out and try to reach the west. But Rochus Misch did not leave. He was a soldier. He was a member of the bodyguard. His job was to stay at his post. His loyalty, whether to Hitler or just to the job itself, was absolute. He sat at his switchboard, listening as the Red Army's ring around the city center grew tighter. The calls became shorter, more desperate. They are in the next street. They are at the station. They are at the Reich Chancellery. Above us, the bunker was no longer a headquarters. It was a coffin. And Rochus Misch, the telephone operator, was now the chronicler of its final dying breaths. The end was not weeks or days away. It was hours. The Führer's declaration that the war was lost, that he would stay in Berlin to die, changed everything. The spell that had held the Third Reich together for 12 years was broken. And the Fuhrerbunker changed with it. Before April 22nd, it was a military headquarters. Now it became a waiting room for the end of the world. It split into two distinct, bizarre realities. On one side of the steel doors, Hitler, Goebbels, and Martin Bormann planned the final nihilistic act. They discussed suicide. They drafted bitter, hateful political testaments. On the other side, in the upper bunker, in the canteens and corridors, a different kind of madness took over, with the leader having given up. The staff gave up too. A frantic, desperate gallows humor emerged. The remaining adjutants, secretaries, and guards who had been living under intense, terrified discipline suddenly snapped. The stores were opened. The finest champagne, the rarest brandy, the boxes of cigarettes, all were consumed in a non-stop party. Loud music was played. People who had been formal colleagues just days before were now drinking, dancing, and smoking, their laughter echoing manically through the concrete halls. And at the center of it all, at his switchboard, sat Rochus Misch. He was the sober eye in this hurricane of despair. He watched the adjutants he respected, the secretaries he knew, descend into this final, desperate hedonism. He was still a soldier. He was still on duty. His job, however, had become surreal. He was no longer connecting generals to the front line. The front line was now the garden, 50 feet above his head. His calls were now almost exclusively internal. He connected the Goebbels' quarters to Hitler's study. He connected Martin Bormann's office to the canteen, trying to find a drunken adjutant. He was the witness to the bunker's two faces, the face of cold, fanatic suicide and the face of hysterical, drunken collapse. In this chaos, Misch found himself drawn more and more to the only island of perceived innocence, the Goebbels' children. He was a father himself, worried sick about his own wife and child in the city. He would see the 6 children, led by the eldest, 12-year-old Helga, playing in the corridor right outside his switchboard. They would sing songs for the soldiers. They would ask Misch questions playing with his headset. He saw their mother, Magda Goebbels, as a cold, distant figure. She was a fanatic, loyal to Hitler in a way that seemed to transcend her own humanity. Misch watched her, a woman of high society, now trapped, her face a mask of grim determination. He heard the stories. He heard how Hitler's inner circle, including the pilot Hanna Reich, had begged Magda to let them fly the children out of Berlin, to save them. And he heard Magda's cold, final answer. No. She had said, "Any world that exists after National Socialism is not a world worth living in. My children do not deserve to live in that world." Misch, the father, could not understand this. He would give the children small treats. He would talk to them, a moment of warmth. He did not know he was talking to ghosts. Then, the final desperate betrayal hammered the nail into the bunker's coffin. A message arrived at the switchboard. It was a Reuters news report picked up by a listening station. Heinrich Himmler, faithful Heinrich, the head of the SS, the man whose organization Misch belonged to, had been caught. He was not caught by the enemy. He was caught by the news. Himmler was secretly negotiating a complete surrender of all German forces to the Western Allies behind Hitler's back. He was offering to save himself while his Führer was trapped in Berlin. When Misch passed this message on, the resulting explosion was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. Hitler's rage at Göring had been a fire. This was a nuclear meltdown. He screamed. He raged. He cursed Himmler as the most loyal and faithless of all traitors. His entire world, his entire belief system, was built on loyalty. And now, his last and most loyal paladin had stabbed him in the back. This betrayal seemed to trigger the final act. Hitler had been betrayed by the Air Force, Göring. He had been betrayed by the SS, Himmler. He had been betrayed by the army, his generals. Only one person had been completely, unequivocally loyal. Only one person had traveled from the south of Germany into the burning city of Berlin, just to be with him at the end, Eva Braun. On the night of April 28th, as the Soviet artillery shook the very ground, Hitler announced his final decision. He was going to reward Eva Braun's loyalty. He was going to marry her. The bunker was thrown into a surreal flurry of activity. This was not a military order. It was a wedding. A city councillor, Walter Wagner, was found. He was a low-level Nazi party official who was, at that moment, fighting in a Volkssturm unit just a few blocks away. He was pulled out of his foxhole, covered in dust, and brought down into the bunker. Rochus Misch watched it all from his switchboard, just yards away. He saw them assemble in the small map room. Hitler in his black uniform jacket, Eva Braun in a dark silk dress. Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann were the witnesses. Wagner, the terrified city official, performed the service. It was a fast, grim, civil ceremony. He asked them if they were of pure Aryan descent. They both said yes. They exchanged rings, and just like that, at approximately 12:30 a.m. on April 29th, Eva Braun became Eva Hitler. Misch watched them emerge. A small, pathetic wedding breakfast was held. Champagne was served. Hitler, who did not drink, sipped. He spoke of the old days. He seemed calm, detached. His decision was made. But the night was not over. The marriage was a personal act. The next act was political. Hitler motioned for his youngest secretary, Traudl Junge. He had one last thing to do. He was going to write his will. Junge, a woman in her 20s, grabbed her notepad and followed him into his private conference room. For the next several hours, Hitler, in a calm, monotonous voice, dictated his private and political testament. Misch, at his post, saw them go in. He saw the door close. He was the guard. Inside that room, Hitler was dictating pure venom. He blamed the entire war, a war he had started, on international Jewry. He raged against the traitors. He officially expelled Göring and Himmler from the Nazi Party. He laid out a new government for a country that no longer existed. And then he announced his private decision. "My wife and I," he dictated, "choose death to escape the shame of capitulation." He had been married for less than an hour, and he was already planning his wife's death. As dawn broke on April 29th, the bunker was heavy with this new, final knowledge. The wedding had happened. The will was written. Now, there was only one thing left to do. But Hitler had a problem. He had the cyanide capsules. They had been provided by the SS, by Himmler. And Hitler was now consumed by a new paranoia. What if Himmler, the ultimate traitor, had given him fake capsules? What if they were not poison but a sleeping draft? What if he was captured alive, unconscious, and put on display in a cage in Moscow? He had to test them. He called for his personal physician, Dr. Stumpfegger. He called for his dog handler, Sergeant Fritz Tornow. And he called for his most beloved, most loyal companion in the bunker. His German shepherd, Blondie Rochus Misch, knew this dog. Everyone knew Blondie. The dog was a fixture, a symbol of the human side of Hitler. Misch had seen Hitler play with her, feed her, dote on her. Dr. Stumpfegger was ordered to administer one of the cyanide capsules to the dog. They took Blondie to the bathroom, just off the main corridor. Sergeant Tornow held her muzzle open. The doctor crushed the glass ampule in her mouth. The effect was instantaneous. Misch later said he heard a short yelp. The dog collapsed, dead in an instant. Hitler, who was not in the room, was told the news. The poison was good. He was reportedly inconsolable. He went to his room and shut the door. For the rest of the bunker, this was the true signal. The drinking party stopped. The manic laughter died. If Hitler could kill his dog, he could kill himself. This was not a drill. This was the end. The horror was not over. Blondie had recently had a litter of puppies who were also in the bunker. Hitler, in his final cold nihilism, gave another order. The dog handler, Tornow, was to take the puppies and his own personal dog up to the Chancellery Garden and shoot them. Misch heard the shots, faint, between the artillery blasts. The last small piece of life in the bunker was extinguished. The 29th of April bled into the 30th. The bunker was now a pressure cooker of pure, silent dread. Misch was at his post, but the phones were almost all dead. The lines to the outside world had been cut, one, by the shelling. The Reich was now the size of this concrete box. Then, one last critical piece of news arrived, likely by radio. Benito Mussolini, Hitler's ally, his friend, had been captured by Italian partisans. He and his mistress had been shot, and their bodies were hung upside down from a petrol station in Milan for the crowds to mock and defile. This news sealed Hitler's final resolve. He would not be captured. His body would not be a spectacle. He gave his final military order. He spoke to his adjutant, Otto Günsche. He needed petrol. Günsche and Hitler's personal driver, Erich Kempka, were sent on a desperate suicidal mission. They had to go up into the Chancellery Garden, which was under direct Soviet machine gun and artillery fire, to find wrecked and abandoned vehicles. They siphoned petrol, can by can, until they had gathered nearly 200 liters. Rochus Misch watched them. He saw the SS guards carrying the heavy cans of fuel, not out of the bunker, but into it. They were stored by the emergency exit that led up to the garden. Misch, the quiet painter, the telephone operator, knew exactly what he was looking at. He was looking at a funeral pyre. The morning of April 30th arrived. The atmosphere was no longer panic. It was quiet. It was resolve. Hitler had a brief, final lunch of pasta. At approximately 2:30 p.m., the word was given. The Führer was going to say his final farewell. The staff was assembled in the narrow corridor. The secretaries, Traudl Junge, Gerda Christian, the inner circle, Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, the Hitler youth leader, Arthur Axmann, and the staff, the adjutants, the guards, and the telephone operator, Rochus Misch, stood in that line. Hitler emerged from his private room. He was a stooped, gray man, his hands trembling. With him was his wife of just 40 hours, Eva Hitler. He walked down the line, one by one. He shook each person's hand. He looked them in the eye. He said very little. When he reached Rochus Misch, the man who had connected his calls for years, the man who had been his invisible shadow, Hitler simply nodded. He shook his hand. A final, silent goodbye. Misch watched as Hitler and Eva Braun turned. They walked back to their private room. An adjutant closed the steel door behind them. Rochus Misch walked the few paces back to his switchboard. He sat down. His post was just yards from that closed steel door. And now, he waited. Rochus Misch sat at his post. The bunker was silent. The entire complex, filled with adjutants, doctors, and guards, held its breath. The only sound was the constant, dull vibration of the diesel generator and the distant, rhythmic thunder of the Soviet shells. Misch's gaze was fixed on the steel door to Hitler's private anteroom. He was just yards away. How long did he wait? 10 minutes? 20? In that concrete tomb, time had lost all meaning. Then, the silence was broken. A commotion came from the corridor. Heinz Linge, Hitler's personal valet, emerged. He had a look of controlled panic. He walked to the closed steel door. He hesitated. Then he opened it. Linge went inside. He was in there for only a moment. He came back out, his face pale, and closed the door. He walked a few steps and found Martin Bormann, the powerful head of the Chancellery, who had been waiting. Linge leaned in and whispered to Bormann. Then, someone, Misch was never sure who, perhaps Bormann, perhaps Linge, walked towards the main conference room where the adjutants were gathered, and that is when Rochus Misch and the rest of the bunker heard the 4 words that ended an era. Der Chef ist tot. The boss is dead. The effect was not panic. It was not chaos. It was numbness. The thing they had been waiting for, the event that had held them all captive, had finally happened. Misch stayed at his post. It was not his job to investigate. It was his job to answer the phone. A few moments later, the steel door opened again. This time, Linge, Bormann, Goebbels, and a few others went inside. The door was left open. From his chair at the switchboard, Rochus Misch could see inside. He described the scene later with the flat, emotionless detail of a man still in shock. He saw Hitler, slumped forward over the arm of the sofa. He had shot himself in the right temple. A pool of blood was staining the carpet. On the other end of the sofa, Eva Hitler, formerly Eva Braun, was sitting with her legs tucked underneath her. Her eyes were open. She was dead. She had taken cyanide. A pistol lay on the floor near Hitler's feet. But she had not used it. Misch just looked. He was the painter, observing a grotesque and final masterpiece. He watched as Otto Gunsche, Hitler's adjutant, entered the room. He watched as they wrapped Hitler's head in a blanket to cover the catastrophic exit wound. Then they began the breakout, not of the bunker, but of the bodies. SS guards, under Gunsche's orders, lifted Hitler's body. It was wrapped in a field-gray blanket. They carried it past Rochus Misch, who was still sitting at his switchboard. He watched his Führer's body, the man he had served for 6 years, being carried up the stairs. Then they came back. Martin Bormann himself lifted the body of Eva Hitler. He carried her, as one would carry a bride, past Misch and up the stairs. Misch heard their heavy footsteps on the concrete stairs. He heard them open the emergency exit door. He heard the sudden sharp rattle of Soviet machine gun fire from the garden above. And then he smelled it. Through the open door, a new, sickeningly sweet smell wafted down into the bunker, mixing with the diesel fumes. It was the smell of petrol, and it was the smell of burning flesh. The SS guards, standing in a shell crater, had poured the 200 liters of fuel over the bodies and thrown a match. Hitler was gone. Misch sat at his post. His job was over. The man he was hired to serve was now a column of black smoke in the Chancellery garden. But a new, and far more sinister, drama was about to unfold. With Hitler dead, the new Führer of Germany, as per Hitler's political testament, was Joseph Goebbels. His reign would last less than 1 day. Misch watched as Magda Goebbels, her face pale and rigid, walked her 6 children from their small bunker room to the main area. The children were dressed in their nightgowns. They were told they were going to get an injection, a shot, to protect them from the bombs and the sickness. Rochus Misch, the father, watched them. He knew these children. He had shared his rations with them. They had played by his chair. He watched as their mother and Hitler's personal physician, Dr. Stumpfegger, led them, one by one, into a private room. The eldest, 12-year-old Helga, was suspicious. She was smart. She knew something was wrong. Witnesses reported hearing a small struggle. She fought, but she was a child. Magda Goebbels and the doctor were efficient. One by one, they gave each child a drugged drink to make them sleep. And then, as they slept, they crushed a cyanide ampule into each of their small mouths. Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Holda, Hedda, Haida. In the space of 20 minutes, the 6 children of the bunker were all dead. Misch did not see this final act, but he saw what happened next. He saw Magda Goebbels emerge from the room. Her face was gray. Like a stone, Misch said. She did not cry. She did not speak. She walked, like an automaton, back to her own room. Misch then saw her a short time later, playing solitaire, alone, in her room. Her mind, her humanity, was gone. The horror was now complete. Joseph Goebbels, the new one-day Führer, had nothing left to live for. His leader was dead. His children were dead. Goebbels and his wife Magda walked calmly past Rochus Misch's switchboard. They did not say goodbye. They, too, were now ghosts. They walked up the stairs to the Chancellery garden, the same garden where Hitler's body was still smoldering. They did not want to be burned. They had a different plan. They were loyal to the end. They would follow their Führer's example, but with their own twist. They stood in the garden in the middle of a global war as Soviet shells exploded around them. They ordered their SS adjutant to do one last job. They took cyanide, and as the poison took effect, the adjutant shot them both in the back of the head. Their bodies were then set on fire. In the bunker, Rochus Misch was now almost completely alone. The Führer was dead. Eva was dead. The Goebbels family was dead. Bormann, the adjutants, the secretaries, they were all now planning a mass breakout. Their new plan was to flee the bunker, try to get through the Soviet lines, and escape Berlin. The gallows party was over. It was now pure animal panic. They formed groups. General Mohnke, the military commander, organized the first group. Traudl Junge, Hitler's secretary, joined them. They grabbed weapons, food, and water. They came to Rochus Misch, still at his switchboard. "Misch," they said, "come with us. It's over. We are breaking out." And Rochus Misch said no. He was a soldier. He had not been relieved of his post. His loyalty, whether to a dead man or to the abstract concept of duty, was absolute. He was the switchboard operator. He would stay at his post. He watched the first group run up the stairs and out into the chaos of Berlin. A second group formed. More generals, more staff. Again, they urged him to come. "Misch, it's madness. You will die here." Again, He said no. His loyalty was so profound, so ingrained, that it had become absurd. He was a telephone operator in an empty building with no one to call, surrounded by 1,000,000 enemy soldiers, and he would not leave his chair. He sat there alone for hours. The bunker was now truly a tomb. The diesel generator, its fuel finally running out, sputtered and died. The lights went off. The only illumination was the emergency backup, which cast long, terrifying shadows. The only sound was the silence. The artillery had, for a moment, stopped. And then a new sound, a sound he had been dreading. Footsteps, heavy boots, coming from above. Not from the garden exit, but from the Reich Chancellery itself. The Soviets were in the building. Misch finally understood. His duty was over. There was no one left to serve. He did one last thing. He was, after all, a professional. He took his headset off and placed it neatly on the switchboard. He straightened his uniform, he walked up the stairs, out of the lower bunker, and into the upper bunker. He walked past the children's room, now a mausoleum. He walked past the canteen, littered with the remnants of the final party. He walked to the exit, into the ruins of the Chancellery. He was the last man. Everyone else was dead or had fled. He stepped out into the daylight. It was May 2nd, 1945. He was blinded. After months underground, the light was a physical pain. The city, his city, was gone. It was not a city. It was a hellscape of jagged ruins and black smoke. He was almost immediately captured by Soviet soldiers. For the Russians, finding a man in a pristine SS bodyguard uniform, climbing out of the Führer's personal bunker, was like finding a mythological creature. They did not believe his story. Rochus Misch, the man who just wanted to be a painter, was now the most valuable and most suspected prisoner on earth. He was flown to Moscow. He was taken to the infamous Lubyanka prison, and he was personally interrogated by Stalin's top secret police generals. The problem was simple. The Soviets had found the burned bodies in the garden, but they were charred beyond recognition. Stalin did not believe Hitler was dead. Stalin believed it was a trick, a body double. He believed Hitler had escaped, and that Rochus Misch, the personal telephone operator, knew where he was. Misch told them the truth. He told them about the suicide. He told them about the bodies. He told them about the petrol. They did not believe him. They thought his loyalty was so deep, he was still protecting his Führer. They tortured him. They beat him. They put him in isolation. They subjected him to mock executions, and for 9 years, Rochus Misch was held in a Soviet gulag, a hard labor camp, all because he had been the last man. He had been the witness. He was a painter from Silesia who had been chained to history. He was finally released in 1953 after Stalin's death. He returned to a divided Berlin, a city he no longer recognized. He was a man out of time, a ghost from an era everyone wanted to forget. And what happens to a man who has witnessed the end of the world? Rochus Misch did not go on tour. He did not seek fame. He did what the painter in him always knew how to do. He found his wife, Gerda. He rebuilt his life. He opened a small shop, a painting and decorating business. For the next 50 years, Rochus Misch lived a quiet, anonymous life. He was a husband, a father, a small business owner. His neighbors in Berlin had no idea that the quiet man who sold them wallpaper was the same man who had taken the final calls for Adolf Hitler. He rarely spoke of the war. He carried his secrets with him. As the years passed, the other survivors of the bunker died. Traudl Junge, the secretary, Otto Günsche, the adjutant. One by one, the witnesses fell silent, until, finally, there was only one. Rochus Misch, the telephone operator, the last living witness to the madness in the Fuhrerbunker. He died in 2013 at the age of 96. He was the last man. He had seen the 1,000-year Reich begin. And he was the last man to turn out the lights. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us unearth more of these forgotten histories. Subscribe to this channel to stay connected. Every one of these stories deserves to be remembered, and we want to hear from you. We have an incredible community here from all over the world. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Also, many of these events from the Second World War have echoes in the First World War. If you would like us to make more videos on the forgotten heroes and untold stories of WWW1, let us in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping this history alive. In a sterile Washington, D.C. boardroom, a committee of high-ranking military officers and Red Cross officials listened intently. At the head of the table sat the one man who held the key to saving hundreds of thousands of lives on the battlefields of the Second World War. He was not a general. He was a doctor. His name was Charles R. Drew. He had just achieved the impossible, creating a system to bank and transport life-saving blood plasma on an industrial scale. His Blood for Britain program was already a legend, snatching wounded civilians from the jaws of death during the Blitz. Now, America, on the brink of war itself, needed him to do it for them. The officials approved his entire plan. The logistics, the sterile collection, the processing, the refrigerated blood-mobile trucks, all of it. And then, they added one condition, one directive, handed down from the highest levels of the War Department. The program would not accept blood donations from Negro donors. The man who had just revolutionized modern medicine, the man they were hailing as a national hero, the man sitting at that very table, was an African American, and he was being told that his own blood, and the blood of people who looked like him, was inferior, contaminated, and unacceptable for the war effort. This is the story of a scientific breakthrough that changed warfare forever, and the story of the brilliant mind who was forced to choose between his life's work and his principles. In 1939, as Europe plunged into darkness, military strategists faced a terrifying, ancient problem. In any war, the deadliest enemy is not the bullet, but the clock. When a soldier is wounded, a golden hour begins. The primary killer is not always the wound itself, but the catastrophic loss of blood, leading to circulatory shock. A body in shock starves its own organs of oxygen. The solution has been known for centuries, a blood transfusion. But on a battlefield, this solution was a logistical nightmare. The problem was whole blood itself. First, it was fragile. Once drawn from a donor, whole blood had a practical shelf life of only a few days, even when refrigerated. Battlefield refrigeration was a fantasy. Second, it was specific. Blood must be typed. Give a man with type A blood a transfusion of type B, and his own immune system will attack the new blood, killing him just as surely as the enemy's bullet. Organizing a chaotic, mobile battlefield hospital by A, B, AB, and O blood types was nearly impossible. Surgeons in the field were desperate. They watched thousands of young men die from wounds that should have been survivable. They needed a substitute. They needed something that could be stored for weeks, transported without refrigeration, and given to any soldier, regardless of his blood type. They needed a medical miracle. That miracle would come from the mind of a man who had spent his entire life overcoming obstacles. Charles Richard Drew was born in 1,904 inches, Washington, D.C. His father was a carpet layer. From a young age, Drew demonstrated an astonishing brilliance, not just in academics but in athletics. He was a star quarterback, a track champion, a gifted leader. He earned an athletic scholarship to Amherst College, where he was one of only a handful of black students. He excelled, but when he graduated, his path to medical school in America was blocked. Top-tier medical schools in the 1,920 did not admit many, if any, black students. Undeterred, Drew looked north. He enrolled at McGill University in Montreal, Canada, a more progressive institution. It was there his fascination with blood transfusions began, working alongside Dr. John Beatty, who was studying the problems of shock. Drew thrived. He finished second in his entire graduating class. He stayed to complete his surgical residency, becoming an expert in the complex chemistry of blood. In 1938, he earned a prestigious fellowship to Columbia University in New York, with the specific goal of earning a doctorate. His timing was perfect. The university's surgery department was a hotbed of research into blood. They assigned Drew to a challenging theoretical problem: how to create a blood bank. At the time, this concept was science fiction. But Drew, with his surgical precision and researcher's mind, dove in. He immediately discarded the idea of banking whole blood. The problems of storage and typing were unsolvable. He turned his focus to a component that was often overlooked: plasma. Plasma is the pale yellow liquid that makes up over half of blood's volume. It is the river that carries the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Drew, and others before him, knew plasma had incredible properties. If you separated it from the red cells, it was far more stable. Crucially, plasma does not contain the antigens that determine blood type. It is universal. A type A soldier could receive type O plasma. A type B soldier could receive type AB plasma. It made no difference. This was the solution. But it was only a theoretical solution. The challenge was scaling it. How do you process thousands of pints of blood a day? How do you separate the plasma efficiently? How do you store it contamination-free? And how do you dry it? This was Drew's true genius. He wasn't just a theorist, he was a systems man. He developed and perfected the complex techniques for mass production. He established the protocols for centrifuging the blood, spinning it at high speeds to separate the heavy red cells from the light plasma. He developed methods for siphoning off the plasma into sterile containers. Most importantly, he mastered the new freeze-drying process, known as lyophilization. The plasma was frozen solid, then put in a vacuum, which turned the ice directly into vapor, leaving behind a fine, powdered plasma in a sterile, sealed bottle. This powder was as stable as sugar. It weighed almost nothing. It could be shipped anywhere in the world and stored for months, perhaps years. When a medic on the front lines needed it, he simply added a bottle of sterile distilled water, shook it, and had a life-saving universal transfusion ready in minutes. Drew compiled his findings into his doctoral thesis, Banked Blood, a Study in Blood Preservation. It was a masterpiece of medical science. His professors called it revolutionary. He became the first African American to earn a Doctor of Science in Medicine degree from Columbia. It was 1940, and across the Atlantic, bombs were raining down on London. The Battle of Britain was raging. The German Luftwaffe was systematically trying to bomb the British people into submission. Civilian casualties were catastrophic. The British health system was collapsing, their blood supplies exhausted. They were desperate. They sent an urgent plea to America, which was not yet in the war. Send us blood. The American medical community knew this was impossible. They couldn't ship whole blood across an ocean. But a small group of doctors who knew of Drew's research realized there was another way. They formed a new organization with a desperate goal. They needed a medical director, a brilliant organizer, a man who understood the science of plasma from top to bottom. There was only one choice. They asked Dr. Charles R. Drew to lead the project. Drew accepted immediately. He was given an office at Presbyterian Hospital in New York, and a seemingly impossible task: collect thousands of pints of blood from New York volunteers, process it into dried plasma, and ship it to England as fast as possible. All this without any existing infrastructure. Drew built the infrastructure from scratch. He organized donor drives, designed mobile blood collection units, the first bloodmobiles, and set up a processing lab that ran 24 hours a day. He was a force of nature, meticulous, demanding, and inspiring. He trained nurses, technicians, and doctors, enforcing his own new rigid standards for sterility. He knew that a single contaminated batch could be disastrous, not just for the patients, but for the entire concept of plasma. His team worked with a frantic energy. They knew lives depended on them. Within 5 months, Drew's program had collected, processed, and shipped over 14,000 units of plasma. In London, the plasma arrived like a miracle. Medics pulled victims from the rubble of bombed-out buildings, mothers, children, firemen, and administered the rehydrated plasma on the spot. It stabilized them, pulling them back from the brink of shock, giving surgeons the precious time they needed to operate. It was an unambiguous, staggering success. The British press called it a lifeline. Dr. Charles Drew was hailed as a savior. His success was so profound that it caught the attention of his own government. In late 1940, with the world in flames, the United States knew it could not stay neutral forever. The military began a quiet, massive mobilization, and its top surgeons knew that if America went to war, it would face the same blood crisis Britain had. They needed a national blood bank, and they needed it yesterday. The American Red Cross, in partnership with the National Research Council, was tasked with creating this national program. They needed a director, and again, there was only one possible choice. In early 1941, Dr. Charles Drew was appointed the first-ever medical director of the American Red Cross Blood Bank. This was a monumental achievement. A black man had been placed in charge of one of the nation's most critical wartime medical projects. It was a position of immense power and responsibility. Drew essentially wrote the manual. He designed the national network of collection centers, the storage systems, the shipping logistics. He was, in every sense of the term, the father of the blood bank. He began his work with the same tireless energy he had shown during the Blood for Britain campaign. But almost immediately, he ran into a wall. It was not a scientific wall, but a political one. The American Red Cross was a quasi-governmental organization, and it took its directives from the U.S. military. And the military had a standing policy regarding blood. It was a policy rooted not in science, but in deep-seated, systemic racism. The directive was simple and blunt. The blood of persons of the colored race was not to be accepted. Drew was stunned. He was the world's leading expert on the subject, and he was being told to enforce a rule that was a scientific lie. He protested immediately and vigorously. He wrote letters, attended meetings, and argued with military officials. He stated, in no uncertain terms, that there was no scientific difference whatsoever between the blood of a black person and a white person. Plasma was plasma. To reject the blood of millions of patriotic black Americans who wanted to donate was not only insulting, it was medically indefensible and would weaken the war effort. His protests were ignored. The policy stood. Drew was faced with an agonizing choice. Should he resign in protest? Or should he stay, swallowing his pride, to ensure the program he designed would actually get built and save the lives of soldiers, even if it was built on a foundation of bigotry? He chose to stay. He reasoned that the program itself was too important. The lives of soldiers on the future battlefield were his priority. So, With a heavy heart, he began the work of building a national blood bank that officially rejected men and women who looked exactly like him. This policy did not go unnoticed. The black press, civil rights organizations, and many progressive white doctors were outraged. The irony was grotesque. America was preparing to fight a war against the racist ideology of the Nazis, while enforcing its own racist ideology at home. The pressure mounted. How could America ask black men to fight and die for their country, but refuse to accept their blood to save their fellow soldiers? The military and the Red Cross, facing a public relations disaster, finally buckled. In late 1941, they revised the policy. The revision was, perhaps, even more insulting than the original ban. The new policy was that the Red Cross would accept blood from African Americans. However, it must be processed, stored, and labeled separately. It would be Negro blood, and it would only be given to other Negro soldiers. The military would now operate two parallel blood banks, one white, one black. This was the scene that confronted Dr. Drew. The officials presented this as a compromise. To Drew, it was a catastrophe. It was a lie, codified as national policy. It institutionalized pseudoscience. He was being asked to personally sign off on and manage a system that segregated blood plasma, a substance he knew was universally interchangeable. He was being ordered to use his medical expertise to validate a racist policy. This time, the choice was clear. He could no longer stay silent. In a series of blistering public memos, Dr. Drew condemned the policy. He called it indefensible and unscientific. He wrote that the decision to segregate blood was a stupid blunder that makes a mockery of our democratic ideals. He knew the price of his dissent. He knew he was challenging the entire military hierarchy in a time of national crisis. But his integrity as a scientist and his dignity as a man would not allow him to participate. The program he had built from nothing, the donation centers, the processing labs, the life-saving system ready to save a nation, was being poisoned by this policy. He would not attach his name to a life-saving program built on a destructive lie. In early 1942, just as the program was becoming fully operational and America was reeling from Pearl Harbor, Dr. Charles R. Drew tendered his resignation. Dr. Charles Drew's resignation was a quiet, profound professional detonation. He had walked away from America's single most important wartime medical program at its apex. But he did not disappear. His anger was channeled from his person into his purpose. If he could not fix the system from within, he would build a new, better one from the outside. He returned to his alma mater in Washington, D.C., Howard University. It was the nation's most prestigious black medical school. He was immediately appointed head of the Department of Surgery and chief surgeon. He focused his sights on a new mission. If the American medical establishment was going to use racial barriers to stop men like him from becoming surgeons, he would simply train them himself, and he would train them to be so exceptionally good. The system would not dare to ignore them. Drew became a demanding, relentless teacher. He transformed Howard's surgery program into one of the finest in the nation. He was at the hospital before dawn. He left late at night. He demanded perfection from his residents and students. "Excellence of performance," he famously said, "will transcend artificial barriers." He was training an entire generation of African American surgeons. To them, he was more than a professor. He was living proof that brilliance had no color. And as his protégés entered the medical world, the plasma program he had birthed entered the crucible of war without him. The program Drew had designed was now running at full capacity. It was an industrial marvel. The American Red Cross had collection centers across the nation. Drew's bloodmobiles rolled through cities and towns. In factory-style labs, thousands of technicians followed his written protocols, spinning down the blood. The scale was staggering. By the end of the war, the American public had donated 13.3 million units of blood. This was processed into over 10 million plasma packages. This plasma, frozen or powdered, was shipped to every single front where American soldiers fought. It was deliberately shipped in two separate stacks, one labeled W for white, the other C for colored. On paper in Washington, D.C., the policy was neat and tidy. On the battlefield, paper didn't matter. North Africa, 1,943. An American tank takes a direct hit from a German 88mm shell. It erupts. The crew bails out, horrifically burned. Their blood pressure is plummeting. When a body is severely burned, it hemorrhages plasma from the wound sites. These men were dying, not from the shell, but from circulatory shock. A medic runs to them. He has no time, no whole blood, no way to type match. He has two things in his bag: a sealed bottle of powdered plasma and distilled water. He mixes them, slams in an IV line, and pushes the pale yellow liquid into the soldier's veins. Within minutes, a miracle. The soldier's blood pressure stabilizes. His pulse returns. The plasma was refilling his circulatory system, buying his heart, brain, and kidneys the time they needed to survive. He was evacuated to a hospital, and he lived. This exact scene was repeated thousands of times. On the cold beaches of Anzio, the blood-soaked shores of Normandy, and in the frozen forests of the Battle of the Bulge, the medic standing over that burning tank did not check if the plasma bottle was labeled W or C. He just saw plasma. In the terror of combat, the bureaucratic walls of segregation melted away. When a white soldier was dying in a field hospital, and the only plasma available was labeled C, no surgeon hesitated for a second. They used it. Because Dr. Drew was right. Plasma was just plasma. The enemy had no answer to this. German doctors understood plasma, but their program was small, disorganized, and hamstrung by their own racial ideology, refusing non-Aryan blood. The Japanese military had no equivalent program at all. Their soldiers died on the battlefield from the very same wounds that Americans were now surviving. Dr. Drew's mind had become a strategic advantage, as powerful as a better tank or a faster ship. Saving soldiers wasn't just humanitarian, it was tactical. It kept experienced men alive and returned them to the fight. In 1944, with the war still raging, the military and the Red Cross realized their folly. The segregation policy was not only wrong, it was a logistical nightmare on the front lines. Following mounting complaints from medics, they quietly abandoned it. First, the labels came off, and then, in early 1945, the blood supplies were fully desegregated. It was a victory. But Charles Drew was not there at the Red Cross to celebrate it. That same year, 1944, he was awarded the Spingarn Medal. It was the highest honor given by the NAACP for the outstanding achievement of an African American. He was recognized as the father of the blood bank. His fame was widespread. He was a living legend. The war ended. Drew continued his work at Howard. He continued to operate, to write, and to train. His next great goal was to break the racial barriers in the medical field itself. He became the first African American to be appointed an examiner for the American Board of Surgery. He was granted fellowship in the American College of Surgeons, an honor that had been denied to him for years because of his color. He was at the peak of his powers. A loving family, a brilliant career, and an uncounted number of people who were alive because of him. He was looking to the future. Then came the morning of April 1st. 1950. Dr. Drew, then 45 years old, was driving with 3 other black colleagues to a medical conference in North Carolina. He had been driving all night and was exhausted. Near Burlington, North Carolina, at around 8 a.m., the vehicle veered off the road and overturned 3 times. It was a violent crash. The other passengers were injured, but survived. Charles Drew was not so fortunate. He took the brunt of the impact. His leg was crushed, and his main femoral artery was severed. He was bleeding, massively. When paramedics arrived, they found a man in profound shock. The man who had invented the way to save millions from shock was now dying from it himself. He was rushed to the nearest hospital. It was called Alamance General Hospital. A rumor was born almost instantly, a rumor that would cling to Drew's story for decades. The story was that Alamance General was a whites-only hospital, and that they refused to admit Dr. Drew, a black man, that they refused him a blood transfusion, and that the father of the blood bank bled to death outside a racist hospital. It was a story of profound, tragic irony, and in the racial climate of 1,950 seconds, America, it was entirely believable. But it was not true. The truth, perhaps, was even more complex. The doctors at the hospital, all of them white, rushed to Dr. Drew. They admitted him to the emergency room. They recognized the severity of his condition. They immediately began giving him blood transfusions. They did everything in their power. But Drew's injuries were too catastrophic. He had lost too much blood. His body could not be brought back. His heart had failed. For 2 hours, the doctors tried to revive him. They failed. Dr. Charles R. Drew died on the emergency room table at the age of 45. He was not turned away from a whites-only hospital. But that does not mean racism did not play a role in his death. The real issue was that in the segregated South of 1950, there was no adequate, high-level trauma care for African Americans. The nearest black hospital was miles away and ill-equipped. He was taken to the white hospital by default. Had he been in New York or Washington, D.C., he might have had immediate access to a superior, dedicated trauma center. But he was in rural North Carolina. His death, his friends would argue, was caused not by the malice of one hospital, but by the systemic racism that denied him access to first-class emergency care in the first place. The man who invented the blood bank did not die for lack of blood. He died at the hands of a system he had spent his entire life trying to change. The news of Dr. Charles Drew's death on April 1st, 1950, was a catastrophic blow. He was only 45 years old. The shock was felt most acutely in the community he had dedicated his life to building. At Howard University, surgeries were canceled. His students and residents, the young black surgeons he was molding into a new generation of leaders, walked the halls in stunned silence. He was more than a professor. He was their shield, their champion, and the living proof that they belonged at the highest levels of medicine. His funeral was a national event. Thousands gathered at the 19th Street Baptist Church in Washington, D.C., the same church he had attended as a boy. The crowd was a sea of black professionals, doctors, nurses, lawyers, and educators, alongside the everyday people of his community. But it was also attended by the white medical elite surgeons from Columbia, administrators from the Red Cross, and government officials. They came to pay respects to a man whose genius had forced them to acknowledge him, even when their own policies had tried to erase him. In the weeks that followed, the painful rumor of his death, that he had been turned away by a whites-only hospital, and allowed to bleed to death, began to spread like fire. It was printed in black newspapers and whispered in communities across the country. The story was so potent because it felt true. It was a perfect, tragic encapsulation of the daily injustices of segregated America. It was a story that could have happened, and did happen to countless other Black Americans. The truth, as confirmed by the very colleagues who were in the car with him, was more complex. The white doctors at Alamance General Hospital had tried to save him. They had admitted him. They had administered blood transfusions, but the rumor persisted for decades. It persisted because it highlighted a deeper, systemic failure. Charles Drew did not die because of one doctor's malice. He died because the entire system of segregation meant that in rural North Carolina, a world-class, high-level trauma center, the kind of facility his injuries demanded, was simply not available to a black man in time. The system he fought his entire life had failed him at the most critical moment. But a legacy is not defined by the tragedy of its end. It is defined by the power of its impact. And Drew's impact was already echoing on a global scale. To understand what he had done, one must return to the battlefields he never visited. Before Charles Drew, battlefield medicine was a brutal numbers game. A soldier hit in the torso or a limb, severing an artery, was a dead man. Medics could apply tourniquets and pressure, but they were only delaying the inevitable. The clock was ticking. Without a transfusion, the body's organs would shut down from shock. Drew's plasma program changed the clock. Imagine a beach in Normandy, 1944. A soldier is ripped apart by machine gun fire. He's bleeding out in the sand. A medic crawls to him. He doesn't need a refrigerator. He doesn't need to test the man's blood type. He pulls out 2 sterile bottles from his pack, one of dried plasma powder, one of distilled water. He combines them, shakes the mixture, and plunges the needle into the soldier's arm. He is not replacing the red blood cells. He is doing something more important. He is refilling the system. He is giving the soldier's heart a liquid to pump, keeping the blood pressure from collapsing, keeping the brain and kidneys alive. He has paused the clock. He has bought that soldier 2, 3, maybe 4 more hours. Enough time to get him off the beach, onto a hospital ship, and onto an operating table. Now, multiply that single medic by tens of thousands. Multiply that soldier by hundreds of thousands. In the brutal island-hopping campaigns of the Pacific, where Japanese soldiers fought to the last man, American casualties were horrific. But American survival rates were unlike anything in the history of warfare. Japanese military doctrine accepted massive losses. Their medical logistics were primitive. They had no equivalent to the plasma program. An American soldier and a Japanese soldier could receive the exact same wound, and the American would live, while the Japanese would die. This was Charles Drew's strategic victory. His mind had created a weapon more effective than a new rifle. The 13.3 million pints of blood donated by Americans were processed into over 10 million plasma kits. This logistical miracle, designed by one man, meant that for the first time in human history, an army's most valuable asset, its experienced soldiers, could be saved, healed, and returned to the fight. It was a war of attrition, and Charles Drew had tipped the scales. When the war ended, that impact came home. The massive billion-dollar infrastructure the Red Cross had built based on Drew's designs was not dismantled. It became the foundation for the entire American civilian blood donation system. The bloodmobile you see parked at a high school or a church? That is a direct descendant of the mobile trucks Drew first designed for the Blood for Britain program. The sterile collection methods, the donor screening, the refrigerated transport, all of this became the global standard. But his scientific legacy went even deeper. Drew had proven you could bank, a component of blood. This opened a Pandora's box of new medical science. Plasma, it turned out, was not just one thing. It was a complex soup of life-saving proteins. Scientists, building directly on his work, learned to fractionate plasma, to break it down even further. From this, they isolated albumin, a protein used to treat the very burn victims and shock patients Drew had first targeted. They found factor VIII, a clotting protein that, for the first time, allowed people with hemophilia to live normal lives. They extracted immunoglobulins, the body's own antibodies, creating powerful treatments for tetanus, rabies, and immune deficiencies. Every one of these treatments, which save millions of lives to this day, began with Drew's simple, revolutionary idea: don't bank the blood, bank the plasma. His doctoral thesis, Banked Blood, became the foundational text for a multi-billion-dollar industry and a new branch of medicine. This was his professional legacy. His personal legacy was just as powerful. At Howard University, the men he trained became known as Drew's Boys. They were surgeons of an exceptional caliber. One of them, Dr. W. Montague Cobb, became a renowned anatomist and civil rights leader, fighting to desegregate hospitals. Another, Dr. LaSalle D. Leffall Jr., became one of the nation's most prominent cancer surgeons and the first African-American president of the American College of Surgeons. Drew had proven his motto: excellence of performance will transcend artificial barriers. He had trained a generation of black surgeons who were so undeniably brilliant that the segregated walls of American medicine had no choice but to crumble before them. And yet, for decades, official recognition was muted. The Red Cross, while using his system, was quietly embarrassed. He was a hero who had publicly defied them and exposed their racist policies. It was easier to celebrate the program than the man, but history has a way of finding the truth. Civil rights leaders and his own proud students refused to let his story be a footnote. They fought for his recognition. In 1980, the U.S. Postal Service issued a stamp in his honor in its Great Americans series. Medical schools, public clinics, and research centers across the country were named after him. And, in an act of profound historical correction, the American Red Cross headquarters in Washington, D.C., is today named the Dr. Charles R. Drew National Headquarters. The very institution that had once enforced a policy of segregation now operates from a building bearing the name of the black man who built it and who had the courage to defy it. His story is the story of a profound paradox. He was a fierce patriot who was betrayed by his country's policies. He was a scientist who had to fight a war against ignorance before he could fight the one against death. He created a system to save a nation, even as that nation refused to see him as an equal. The ultimate irony of his life was not the rumor of his death. The ultimate irony is that countless soldiers, saved on the battlefield by his universal plasma, returned home from the war to their towns in Texas, Alabama, and Mississippi, and continued to support the very segregated system that Dr. Drew had defied. His plasma had saved their lives, but it had not changed their minds. His real battle was never just about blood. It was about a simple, scientific, and human truth, that what flows inside us is all the same. It is a truth that was more powerful than any military policy, and a truth that ultimately, long after his death, won out. Thank you for watching this story of a true forgotten hero. The past is filled with men and women like Charles Drew, whose genius and integrity changed our world from the shadows. Their stories deserve to be told. If you believe this history matters, please hit the subscribe button and join our community. It helps this channel continue to unearth these forgotten histories. And we want to hear from you. Leave a comment below, telling us what part of Dr. Drew's story impacted you the most, and let us know where you are watching from. It is incredible to see how far these stories travel. Finally, we are planning our next stories. If you would like to see more videos on the forgotten heroes of World War I, let us know in the comments. Your feedback decides what history we uncover next. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.